tasty burger.
Welcome to the In Session Film Podcast.
Well, welcome to this podcast review for September 5th, 2023, and I'm JD Duran.
Bottoms up, I'm Brendan Cassidy.
Hey, welcome everybody to this conversation where we will talk exclusively about Marshawn Lynch for the next 93 minutes. How fun is that?
That's fun. I feel like many of our listeners would think that we're, disregarding the overall intent. Of
Maybe
this
missing
movie.
the point. Yeah.
Yeah, just a little bit. I think they'd be kicking our bottoms for that one.
I think they would indeed. I think that is very well said. Okay, so we will not be doing that, but we will be talking about the new comedy Bottoms.
Yeah.
Which is something that I've been looking forward to for quite some time, Brendan. I had heard good things about this. It's something that's been on my radar. It's also one of those movies that I feel like trickled out everywhere like 3 weeks ago, and I've just been waiting for this to get to my area.
Yeah.
It took a little longer than maybe I wanted, but we finally got it. So here we are.
We're here.
To talk about it. Is this something that's been on your radar for a little while now?
I've been curious about it for a while, especially knowing the filmmaker tied to this, Emma Seligman, if I'm pronouncing that right.
Yeah.
Because I was kind of a fan of Shiva Baby, her last film.
Yeah, I liked it.
At least I really responded to that film's quirky, almost embarrassing sense of humor. Definitely runs into that realm of awkward comedy. That's certainly an acquired taste.
It took me like 5.5 hours to get through it.
Oh, it's horrific. It really is.
Yeah.
And I was always intrigued by whatever Emma was going to do next. I did not expect it to be what we got. I'll simply say that.
I completely agree. It's a film full of surprises. We'll certainly get into it. And I think with that, we'll go ahead and transition into this conversation. So as Brennan noted, this is directed by Emma Seligman. It stars Rachel Sennott, Edebiri, Ruby Cruz, Havana Rose Liu, Nicholas Galanzine, Marshawn Lynch, of course, among many others that come and go throughout the film. If
Whose
you're not familiar,
idea was that?
I don't
Put
know.
Marshawn Lynch
brilliant.
in this.
Well, I did read this, actually. I don't know if this is exclusively why, but I did read that Marshawn wanted to do this movie. Again, whether he was approached or he actively sought this out, I do not know that. However, he did say in an interview that he really wanted to do this because when he was 16 years old, his sister came out and he did not handle it very well.
Okay.
And so this was an artistic expression of him trying to, getting some redemption for himself. This is a way of him, trying to make up for not responding the way that he felt he should have when his sister came out. So I do know that is part of why he wanted to do this movie.
Interesting, knowing the kind of stuff his character says.
Oh, for sure.
But I think that kind of adds to the joke, maybe.
I agree. If you're not familiar with Bottoms, it is about two unpopular queer high school students who start a fight club to have sex before graduation.
Does that plot synopsis combines at least 4 different movies. You have Fight Club, American Pie. You could probably throw in any John Hughes movie and you get something similar there too.
Oh my gosh.
This movie literally is a blender.
That is one of the best plot synopsises we have ever read in the show. That is excellent work, whoever wrote that.
And it does a great job explaining what the movie's about.
It really does.
It doesn't do anything to tell you how you're going to feel watching it, I'll simply say.
I agree. Well, with all of that laid out, Brendan, what did you think about Bottoms?
What the hell, man? So we talked about Shiva Baby, right? That movie is incredibly awkward. You definitely have to be of a certain comedic mindset, right? You have to be willing to accept that type of comedic style. And not everyone is. And I feel like that's going to be Emma Seligman's MO for quite some time, is just tapping into some type of comedic tapestry that not everyone's willing to accept. Now, Bottoms isn't necessarily awkward like Shiva Baby is, but it is perhaps the most heightened version of a high school comedy that I think I've ever seen. I mean, this is basically a cartoon without it being a literal cartoon. That is the best way I can describe what it's going at tonally.
Yeah.
And I don't know if I found it hilarious or grating.
Okay.
I will say this. I am definitely positive on this movie because anytime I found it kind of grating, I also had such a profound respect for what it was going for, given its, progressive mindset and the progressive nature of its characters, the situation it's putting these characters in, the motivations of them. Because we see a lot of movies nowadays that, whether it be in high school or afterwards, that tap into representation, right? Diversity. And this one certainly does that, but it does so in a way that kind of doesn't give a shit about it. And that's admittedly what I do respect the most about it and anytime it has an opportunity to be serious or insightful with its messaging, it is so heightened as if it just doesn't care about those things.
Yeah.
And I think that is a very refreshing tactic for a movie like this. And I think it's also refreshing that really no one in this movie is likable. Everyone is kind of an asshole, to be very blunt and politically incorrect about it. And I think that's also a refreshing way to go about it too. So I really admire a lot of what this is doing. And admittedly, I laughed enough to say, yeah, that was good. Can't recommend that to everyone, but I really do admire the swings that Emma Seligman is going for here. It does get into some comedic territory that I'm sure we'll talk about, JD. You know where I sometimes draw the line comedically, right?
Yeah.
Especially with regard to violence, right? Even if it's played for laughs. And not to say I find it off-putting here or anything like that, but it's just something that doesn't really work for me. And there's a lot of that, especially in the final act, that admittedly didn't really land with me. It's just given my own tastes. But again, I kind of have to admire the jarring swings that Emma takes us on, and the fact that it just has this uncaring attitude about serious subject matter. It's a nice change of pace there. So it's a very interesting movie.
It is a very interesting movie. I will lay the cat out of the bag here. I quite love this movie a lot. Emma Seligman has talked about how the inspirations for this movie include 2000 teen comedies like Saved, Bring It On, Mean Girls, but also action comedies like Kick-Ass and Edgar Wright's Cornetto trilogy.
Yeah.
She talked about Americana films like Grease and American Graffiti, and all of that is very much on display in a very heightened way, as you're talking about, which is why, in many respects, this film is another one of those examples of what we've been talking about the last few weeks in terms of it's not what a film is about, it's how it's about. There are many tropes here that are familiar, and you will feel that in terms of the bare bones beats that this film follows.
It is the high school comedy through and through.
It is the high school comedy, and it is very brazen in embracing those tropes. It is not trying to hide from them. However, that's why execution is so important when talking about movies, because yes, we could talk about those tropes here, and you could criticize the film for it following the formula to a T, but that doesn't describe what this movie is.
No.
Not in any way, shape, or form, because this film is ardently outrageous. It is remarkably unpredictable. It is so assuming. It is highly entertaining. I mean, we talked about that synopsis about two unpopular queer high school students start a fight club to have sex before, like, that is insane, but that is absolutely what this film is. Like that sentence alone is unpredictable.
It is.
So it does, like, to talk about this film in terms of its tropes, which are very much there, it does the film a disservice because the execution just isn't like anything we've seen before. I also think this film is interesting because it is about these two queer high school students, but the thing with those two characters, we're talking about PJ and Josie, the Edebiri and Sennott characters.
Yeah.
They are not social outcasts because they're gay, which is something that in the 2000s, this film 20 years ago, that's why they would have been outcast. But in this film, it's not because of that. It's because they're ugly and untalented, which is a fun subversive gag throughout.
Yeah, that's what they
film.
say. But in actuality, it's really like they just lack really good social skills. But like the movie, you're right. It does do a good job sort of deconstructing what we would normally expect a message movie like this to be. And to be about that thing, you know, like the queerness of it all, to be kind of front and center, and it sort of puts that on the back burner to tell a different side of that, which I did respect a little bit.
I do love that, and in a way, it absolutely does play out as this whimsical satire about feminism and the harms of the patriarchy, symbolized hilariously, absurdly, with these football players throughout this movie, which I'm sure we'll get more into as this conversation goes.
Yeah.
I do love that. But yes, the plan that these characters hatch, it's about empowering women and self-defense, hoping that it brings unity to the women of their high school. But there is a selfish component to it that the film also unveils throughout the film in comedic, but also some dramatic ways as well. And I do love how the film taps into the sexual frustration of these characters within the confines, the broad perspective this film has about feminism and the patriarchy. Like all of that, I think is really quite brilliant without ever losing sight of how unassuming this film is and how fun it wants to have. And that to me, I think is the difference. It's a little bit like Barbie in that regard, in the sense that, yes, there are some broad stroke ideas here that on their own terms, and how the film is subversive with those ideas, that is truly fascinating and mesmerizing. But also there's so much goofy buffoonery that the film never becomes about those things in this very serious way. Like it's all about having fun with these characters and doing it in a way that you've just never seen before. And it was so unpredictable. I had no idea where this film was going to go once the Fight Club element of it started. I was always surprised by the turns that the film took in that regard, and how it all crystallizes there on the football field is just insane.
Well, it's insane. I'll agree with that. Whether it works for you or not, I think is maybe where we'll have some disparity. But I will say comedically, I knew this film was operating at a very specific level just maybe 10 minutes in when the initial injury occurs to the quarterback player, Jake. Is that his name? The character of Jake? Let's just say that the injury that he suffers, or it's Jeff. I'm sorry. It's the character of Jeff.
Yeah.
The injury that he suffers, which I won't even explain. I just want to leave it for those to experience it for the first time. When that happened, I was like, oh, it's this kind of movie. Okay. Yeah. I think I can roll with this because I appreciate that it's not taking itself seriously, which is really the biggest disparity here between this and Barbie, right? And this is going to be compared to Barbie a lot, and I understand why it could, because it is tackling broadly some similar themes, and it does have a nuanced approach to it, right? It's one of those cases that is talking about, you know, patriarchy in the way that you're talking about, but it's also not necessarily letting its main characters off the hook either, right? I mean, and I kind of like that provocative nature in some ways, and it's actually ironic here because that plot synopsis you laid out there, how these two queer characters started this club so they can meet girls. In any other rom-com of the past, that would be the typical mindset of the straight white male in high school, right? So it's kind of interesting how it's taking the tropes of what it's attacking and still trying to apply it to this other subject matter. And I found that really challenging. And again, what I also appreciate about the movie is that it's also not taking it seriously. It doesn't really want us to talk about those things. It's there and it's willing to at least acknowledge it. But I love that Emma Seligman is more interested in the comedic timing of it all, the weirdness of it all, the lackadaisical nature of it all. It's and for lack of a better term, the sexualized energy of it all. Like that's really the heart of this movie.
No, there absolutely is a sexualized energy to it that I think is really effective here with this film, given the comedy and the characters and the camaraderie and what they're seeking. And yes, everything is heightened to 11. In many ways, these characters do come off as caricatures, which isn't unlike what we see with everything that takes place in Barbie Land at the beginning of Barbie.
Right.
I do think maybe Barbie has a little bit more sincerity with its ideas.
I agree.
Whereas
which is not a knock on this movie. It's just what that movie's going for.
It's not a knock on this film. And I do think there is some sincerity here when that conflict arises near the third act with PJ and Josie, because it's where the film is trying to develop, you know, the notion that there are costs to the consequences of their choices, and that, okay, yes, they were a little selfish. You talked about how these characters are a little rough around the edges, that at times every one of them are doing things, or at least PJ and Josie, they make choices here that are challenging, that might rub you the wrong way. And that is absolutely intentional here. And yes, that's part of the conflict. It's also a lot of the humor of this film as well.
Yep.
It's also quite tropey. You know where that conflict is coming. When it arises, it's no surprise. The surprise factor, again, is in the execution and how the film unveils and ultimately diffuses that conflict. Again, the football sequence at the end of the film is really quite something. But yeah, how the film channels something that is familiar, but doing it in this subversive way where it's less about the identity of these characters sexually, although their thirst for sex is certainly driving it, but it really comes down to that these women have no clue what they're doing. They're making all of this up as they go, and it circles back to how they're ugly and untalented, and they're trying to, I guess, in a way, remedy that by making all this whole thing up to begin with. So like the skill set that ultimately comes out is improvisation more than anything else.
Oh, I mean, yeah, this movie is very heavily improvised. And I feel like the end credits confirm that when we actually get a blooper reel.
Oh, yeah.
I'm so hit or miss on putting bloopers at the end of a comedy like this, because sometimes it feels like a desperate attempt to make sure that we're laughing at the movie. I don't necessarily need that. I think we can definitely sense that this movie has a loose improvisational spirit, as if Emma Seligman, not just as a director but also as a writer, working alongside Rachel Sennott, there was this drive of just being very free and loose in their dynamics, and that's why the film really does work, and why it never loses sight of its farcical nature. I mean, you called this movie satirical, and I think that's certainly apt, but it is so heightened that it's basically a farce. And that's honestly what I like about it. Even at the moment when you feel like it's going to become a little bit more sincere, a little more conflicting, it doesn't forget to be kind of silly, as if to put a few jabs in there to say, yeah, this is the moment of the movie that it's meant to be taken seriously, but we really don't want you to. And I like that push and pull like that.
Well, and for me, I think part of why I find it so biting here is yes, the farcical nature of it and how that is visually depicted,
Mm-hmm.
coupled with some remarkable use of subtlety here. So again, if we're going to use Barbie as a comparison, we
Mm-hmm.
think of the Mattel like board that we
Yeah.
see in that film and how absurdist that it is and how they represent the patriarchy in many ways. In this film, that is symbolized by this football team, the high school football team, this build up to this game with this rival, and you have all of the
Uh-huh.
high school dynamics that come with, with football in high school. And however, of course, it is heightened to 11. Specifically, to the point where they're wearing their pads in full uniform throughout the whole movie.
One
In
of them's in a
class,
cage. One of them's
wherever
in a
they go.
cage.
Well, and don't, you're getting ahead of me, because
Yeah.
I think what's interesting about that, and like the visual representation of them being in their pads, and of course they're quite obtuse as well. And I do find a lot of that very funny. The fact that they're just
Uh-huh.
walking around, not just in their full get up, but with cleats as well. Like the sound of the cleats walking through the hallways, I thought was a fun little gag throughout the film. And
Mm-hmm.
the way the film really doesn't emphasize that, though, is the other part of this that I like. So them being in their football uniform at all times. Even there's one visual gag where one of them, because of how he is exposed, I'll say, he doesn't have any clothes on, but he does
Mm-hmm.
have the pads, the shoulder pads on still. So he has
Yeah.
no clothes on because of the circumstance in which he is found. He's not supposed to have clothes on, but he still has the shoulder pads on. So like the film never really loses sight of that gag, and I do like
Yeah.
that. But there are little subtle things that I like, such as the cleats, which the film doesn't emphasize, but you do hear that constantly
Yeah.
within the sound design. Or the other thing is you see them in class and they're talking, and the film isn't emphasizing this at all because we see our central characters center in frame. But yes, as Brendan noted, in the background is a football player in a cage, just sitting there, just standing there, looking all angry mean, and it is absolutely hilarious. So, like, there is some remarkable subtlety here to the farcical nature of it all that I really appreciate. As much as what we see on the surface is spellbindingly insane and absurd, there's as much going on in the background. Another moment, and I'm sure you noticed this as well. This is maybe like I say subtle because it's in the background and it's
Uh-huh.
not, the film isn't emphasizing it, but there's
Mm-hmm.
a conversation in the cafeteria where again our central women are having a conversation,
Mm-hmm.
and so our attention is supposed to be on that, but our attention isn't on that because there's some guy in the background with a corn dog making sexual references with said corn dog, and you just can't help but notice it. It's like, okay, like this is the kind of movie we were doing here.
And it's not even just that. It's just the literal communication of these characters, these football
Yeah.
players, right? And I hate to make the Barbie comparison once again. I mean, a lot of these two movies are doing some similar things broadly, and that film, Barbie specifically representing the patriarchy through the boardroom sequences at Mattel. I will say I prefer how that argument is handled here in Bottoms, at least with these football players.
Mhm.
And I don't know why. Maybe it's the youthful energy that they literally bring to it. Maybe it's the fact that I don't really know any of these actors, so these new faces kind of help create like a new facade for it. Um, I think it's also Nicholas Galatzin's performance, and for a movie
Mhm.
like this, I really hate saying a white male gives my favorite performance in the movie. But
He's funny though. Yeah.
he comes pretty darn close. The moment that got me, there's a moment of confrontation he has with his girlfriend, played by Havana Rose Liu. She's confronting him about a form of cheating, we'll simply say. And his rebuttal is not only hilarious, the way he rebuttals back to this other character by giving an insult that literally admits to what he did wrong is one of the funniest things I think I've laughed at all year. It's really quite great.
He's very good in the film. I love the moment where he's in his bedroom listening to music, I'll say vaguely. I thought that was really nice as well.
Yeah.
Like he is really good in this movie. I agree. I still think my favorite performance is Io Edebiri, and I think it has something to do with her charm. I do find her very endearing. And also there's something about her stumbling, almost tender sensibility she has as she's trying to make up these stories, and she's talking about how she was in juvie and got into these fights and almost, killed a person. But she says it with almost this honest, tender sincerity.
Oh,
like she's not like
there's a timidity there for sure.
Absolutely. And yet everyone reacts to her as if she's this huge hard ass for doing these things, and yet she conveys anything but that. So I mean, which is obviously the irony they're going for. But I think Edebiri does such a great job of tapping into that in her performance. And I love her chemistry with Sennott. Rachel Sennott is also very good here. Her character is maybe a little bit more directly prickly,
verbose.
A little bit verbose. Yeah, absolutely. But I think Sennott is very good at tapping into that as well. And that's the one thing I do love about this film in terms of what you were saying earlier, how a lot of these characters in many ways are unlikable. The film is very aware of this.
Absolutely.
And it does eventually bring up the fact that these characters do things that are, we'll say, operating in the gray.
Yeah.
And they are forced to confront it. And I do love that the film never loses sight of that, because I think some films have lost sight of it because of the fun or whatever they're trying to do. And while this film is absolutely insane and absurd, there's still a precision to the storytelling and the filmmaking here that I do think is noteworthy, especially for a film like this.
Yeah, the chemistry between Sennott and Edebiri is really quite great. You can tell that they're really friends, and there was probably this attempt to, again, I don't know the behind the scenes or the backstory that led to the two of them being put in this movie, because I know that Rachel Sennett's also an executive producer on it as well. And clearly she has a working relationship with Emma Seligman, given their history together on Shiva Baby, right? But you could definitely tell that there was an attempt to build a genuine friendship off camera with these two, right? And I like that the dynamic individual character traits actually are very different. Like it works best when one character is maybe more unlikable than the other, if you have to rank them in that way, because there is this timidity and this sincerity in Josie when compared to PJ, right? And I think that's what makes Edebiri's performance so strong, because it probably has the most work to do. I'd say Josie is perhaps the one with the most clearly written arc out of all the characters here. So there's definitely more for that character to mine, or that actress to mine, and more for her to navigate through. And I think she's certainly up to the challenge. She definitely makes it work.
Yeah, I agree. I think all of the performances here are very good, and enjoyed a lot of the comedy because of the camaraderie of this cast and how effective they are on screen, whether it be scripted or something they're improvising. And you noted there's a lot of improvising going on here. I don't know how much is what, but the camaraderie of this cast is really excellent. So as the absurdity begins to compound on itself, the awkwardness of it all is very much there, and at times it's thick, and that left me a little bit squirrely in my seat. But I was so engrossed by these performances and their camaraderie that, it obviously didn't really bother me all that much, because ultimately I ended up loving it quite a bit.
Okay.
Shall we talk about the football sequence at the end of this film? Because I know it bothers you.
Well, let me preface by saying, when I say it bothers me, that is not indicative of how I think other people might react to it, because you mentioned that Emma Seligman was also inspired by movies like Kick-Ass and elements of the Cornetto trilogy, Edgar Wright's Cornetto trilogy specifically, when making not just that sequence, but a few sequences throughout the film. Yeah, that football sequence just taps into a comedic sensibility that I just don't find all that funny. Just like bloody, gratuitous violence to children, especially for the sake of comedy. And I get the playfulness of it. It's not meant to affect you in that way. And it doesn't necessarily bother me in that way. It's just, I just never found that funny. I just like that kind of like punchline violence, literally punchline violence, just doesn't really work for me. But I don't necessarily hate the intent or the overall, I guess, approach that Seligman is going for there. Just the execution, just something that never worked for me. But again, I from a narrative standpoint, I like where it ends up. I like the idea that if we're gonna end this high school movie in a tropey way, it's gonna have to end with some big like pep rally / sports game scenario, where like some competitive angle has to come out. Like, I like that it chooses to go that route in a way that is so ridiculous. I mean, pineapple juice is involved. I'll simply say that. I like the intent. It's just an execution thing that just never really landed with me.
Okay. I did quite love it for a couple of reasons. One, it's a lot of it does come down to the farcical nature of it all. That opening visual of the homestands full of people, and of course the football team is there, and on the other side it's just emptiness, vast.
See, like, that's the stuff I liked. That's the stuff I liked from.
Like, love that. So immediately we're put off as to, okay, there's something going down here. And the other element of it comes down to what we were saying earlier in terms of how the film is aware of the edge these characters are teetering on throughout a lot of this film. So as a way to offer a little bit of redemption and offering up the idea that these characters are learning from these past mistakes, they formulate this plan that not only offers and taps into that redemption, but it does it in this really interesting subversive way, because I think this film 20 years ago would have been more about emphasizing some sort of revenge, or we're toppling the patriarchy and look at us go. And it does that, but not in the ways that you would expect, because there are things that happen to PJ and Josie and these women that, this fight club, if you will, like the conflict arises because of, something that, came from the football team, I'll say vaguely. But instead of taking that out on them, it becomes something else entirely. I'll say without getting into spoilers. And that I did find interesting. So, like, in terms of how this film is trying to embrace the tropes of what came before it, it's trying to tap into Bring It On and Mean Girls.
Yeah.
And now we're introducing Kick-Ass and the Cornetto trilogy into all of this as well. And there's an element of violence to it. Like, I love how the film taps into that, maybe less so comedically, although I did laugh at it, but I do like how it's doing it is somewhat reinventing the wheel for this kind of movie, and that it doesn't have to be about toppling the quote unquote antagonist and making sure that our central characters are the ones that we're wholly endeared by. Now, we are, like, that is the result of what happens for sure.
Yeah.
But not because of them taking out the person we think they should. In fact, it's the opposite of that. And I find that really fascinating here.
You're explaining everything I like about it. I guess just from a difference in taste standpoint, I kind of wish I would have been able to get on that side by not seeing high schoolers, kids being literally beaten to death bloodily. I guess that's the thing I didn't need to see. And I kind of think like the inspiration that Kick-Ass has, and for record, I hate Kick-Ass. I think that's a terrible movie. So again, take my opinion for what it's worth. This is simply a matter of taste that I'm projecting onto this movie. It's perhaps the whole subjective objective thing that I usually hate getting into, but I think that's really the essence of this part of the conversation here, right? I think that those same things could have been conveyed from my point of view without that side of it, if that makes sense. Like that part of it I didn't necessarily need to see.
And where I will push back on that, now maybe the extreme of it is where I can see where you're coming from, but I do think that there needed to be at least some, because the redemption that they feel they need to demonstrate comes wholly down to the idea that they manufactured this fight club, and that's what brought them together. That's what had defined them over the course of this specific school year. So for that to not be in play, I think would have been a disservice to the film and the evolution of these characters. So again, the extreme of it, we can debate that. I do agree, but I do think the violence of it and the fighting, all of that had to be there given these characters and
the fighting needed to be there for sure. The fact that they chose to fight a group that you might not expect them to fight, the fact that they're choosing to defend another group that you would not expect them to defend. I like all of that stuff. There's actually a fight scene earlier in the film that I kind of want to at least talk about briefly, because I think it could be a bit triggering for some people. It's probably the one that takes itself a little bit more serious. Yeah, especially given the fact that it's male versus female, I'll simply say, and it doesn't hold back. I will admit that, but I found that more. I'm trying to say this delicately, because I like the scene for what it's doing. I didn't like watching the scene, and I don't condone what that scene is portraying.
But it makes their choices at the end all the more potent, because again, like,
I find more potency without the death and carnage. I think there's more potency when there's more of a lingering emotional effect to latch onto, as opposed to the just freaking kill them all.
Well, again, I'm not arguing the extremism of it. I'm simply saying the gym sequence, as jarring as it might be, and it is a little jarring, there's no doubt about it, but why I find it necessary, because again, what it initially evokes is revenge or possibility, the idea of it, or it is certainly, in terms of where our allegiances lie, there's no ambiguity there. Right. And our central, I was going to say trio, but it's really just the duo and then the fight club, the rest of the women. But, there's conflict that arises because of the choices of PJ and Josie. And I like how the gym sequence certainly evokes that as well. But in terms of the fight club and the patriarchy, again, symbolized by the football team, our allegiances are swung easily in one direction. And so while they're working through their conflict, and as they start to resolve that conflict, we start to think, okay, well, because of how we feel about the football team, we're expecting the fight club to remedy what happened at the gym sequence and against the football team. And then that doesn't happen. In fact, as we've been talking about, it's kind of the opposite. So I think the gym sequence is really important in emphasizing the lack of revenge and giving some potency to that. So in terms of the storytelling, I find all of that pretty riveting.
Yeah.
The extremism of it doesn't bother me like it does you.
Yeah. That's the thing. It's like, I don't need to see a sword stab a high schooler through the head to prove that point to me. Like that. I'll just simply say that.
Fair. And look, I don't really have a rebuttal to that. It doesn't really bother me because the whole film had been extremely farcical from the beginning.
See, that's the thing. I guess it's maybe the way it treats violence. Because like I can look at something like Deadpool and say, oh, this is cartoonish violence. But honestly, looking at some of the violence here, it's like I feel like Emma Seligman is trying to take this graphic nature, make it look kind of real. And that's where I
definitely did not sense that.
See, I kind of sense that. But then again, I'm also someone that thinks Hot Fuzz is not very good either for its violence. So again, take my opinion for what it's worth, which is probably a very small grain of salt for most people. So I get it. Yeah. I absolutely get it.
Yeah, there's definitely a little bit of Hot Fuzz going on here. And I love Hot Fuzz.
There's a disparity.
I love that movie. And I love what this film is trying to do. Again, there has to be a level of violence because Fight Club is the club that they chose to depict in this movie.
It's actually quite uncanny how much of this does follow the narrative trajectory of Fight Club. It literally does follow it pretty closely.
Yeah, and so you were expecting a level of violence, and the violence that comes, it gives credence to the unity and the resolve of these characters and what they had learned over the course of the year and why that Fight Club was important to them. So like, again, I do think the violence is wholly necessary to the film on a thematic level and a narrative level. Again, it just kind of comes down to taste and how you feel about, the death and carnage that you see. And for me, it like, because everything is done so playfully and so insanely that, it was in beat with everything else. I never sensed any sort of realism or pragmatism to the violence. It's all done with a caricature tone in mind, in my opinion.
I'd rather see them spill rainbow blood or something like that.
Okay, sure. I mean, that would have been fine too.
Yeah.
I mean, and then the unexpected explosion.
Oh, see, I didn't find that unexpected at all. I laughed, but the way that the camera pans, it's like, oh, this is when. Yep, there it goes.
Well, unexpected in terms of
from the character's point of view.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. From an audience standpoint, I think I don't think the film is necessarily trying to surprise the audience. I think it knows it's prepping you that this is when it's happening. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So I had a lot of fun with it. It's so insane. I did not anticipate that this is the movie that we were going to get. But I thought it was a lot of fun.
Neither did I.
And I guess the last note, and then we can wind down here. Marshawn Lynch, I thought was
great.
Really fun. Yeah, he was very good.
I think we need to put sports players in movies more often.
Absolutely.
Because they have a level of screen presence that actors just don't have, and it's because they're not trained to be actors. So you see them play off actors in a way that we just don't really know how to comprehend, right? Like I kind of felt the same way when we watched Uncut Gems, right? And just in a very different way, but in this case, with Marshawn Lynch, he's really funny in this.
He's so good, and I love the irony that Marshawn Lynch, this notable NFL player, really has nothing to do with the football in this film at all.
Well,
he's around the characters.
That's the irony of it, that you have this great football player and he surrounds himself by, or he works for a school with these terrible football players.
Well, yeah, like they're in the same classroom together, but the majority of his scenes are with the Fight Club or with PJ and Josie. Like I don't even know if he has a direct interaction with any of the football players unless it's like that opening scene when he's just speaking to the classroom broadly speaking, and he mentions one of them, in this brief little instance. Yeah. But mostly, 99% of what he's doing here has to do with PJ and Josie and their Fight Club. That's where we see him interact the most. And I love that. Like he could have easily have just been there to speak to the football humor and the absurdity of that, but
it kind of plays into the meta component of it too, which I really liked. So,
but he really does kind of, it all comes down to, his, a lot of the comedy he has toward women in general is unexpected, but very funny.
It's very funny. Yeah, he's very good in the movie. I agree.
Yeah, he's great. Any final thoughts on Bottoms?
I don't know if I recommend this movie, but I definitely like it. Again, like this is why I think this age of film is so interesting, JD, because you come into film criticism, you first start this with the mindset that whether you like a movie or not means you want people to check it out.
Mm-hmm.
And I do want people to check this movie out, but I know a couple of people that I won't recommend this to. It's just like,
yeah.
and sometimes all you can do is talk about why you liked it, but that doesn't necessarily mean you recommend it. It means you endorse it, but it doesn't mean you necessarily recommend it to everybody.
Yeah.
And I feel like we're saying that a lot more nowadays, which is so interesting. And I think this is yet another representation of that. So yeah, times are changing. Films are getting weird. Films are getting weird, and I love that this is a comedy that features these queer characters that are inherently, like, this film really has nothing to do with them interacting within a society that doesn't accept them for being queer. Like, right.
As soon as this movie begins, we are way beyond that. And I love that we're now at a point where we can have queer films that isn't about them being outcast because they're queer.
Yeah.
Where we can accept these characters for who they are from the get-go, and then it becomes about their identity in something else. And in the case of PJ and Josie, it's that they're ugly and untalented, as they say.
Yeah.
And how that ends up being this driving force throughout the film, coupled with their sexual frustration, I guess. Really, those two things are what's driving it, and the fact that they're conjuring up this fight club just because they want to have sex with these girls, like, that is a very funny premise.
Yeah, for sure.
And that's what this film becomes about. Like, I like that we've gotten to a point, hopefully anyway, if I'm being optimistic, in our culture that we can have these kinds of films where we don't just have to wrestle with these characters and their sexuality.
It eventually avoids, or potentially, I should say, avoids the, I guess, the trappings of preachiness that some people might want to accuse it for.
Yeah.
And not to say that preachiness is necessarily a bad thing. Some movies need to be on a soapbox to convey a certain message. I understand that, but you're right. We're at a time and place that maybe that's not as necessary for this type of progressive minded story. It just it just exists within the realm of 2023, right? And then just kind of let it be. Let it be its own thing.
Absolutely. And I do think the film will be noteworthy in that regard, especially for this genre of comedy in the teen high school realm.
Yeah.
It's a very unique film. It feels familiar in a lot of ways, but I promise you've never seen this movie. It is.
Yeah, you've never seen this energy before.
Absolutely. I absolutely loved it. And again, I'll just echo this cast. They're all very good. Love the direction by Emma Seligman. I know Brendan and I might debate that a little bit, but I do really like her direction here. And
I like her direction as well. It's mostly just some of the violence that I'm a little...
the violence of it. Yeah, I didn't have a problem with. I really enjoyed this quite a bit. As Brendan said, I guess I recommend it. It's hard to recommend this film. It won't be for everybody, but certainly one that I loved for whatever that's worth. At any rate, we have a written review of this that you can see at InSessionFilm.com. If you agree or disagree with anything we had to say here, you can leave a comment on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. If you're watching on YouTube, you can leave a comment below. You can always email us InSessionFilm@gmail.com. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast on Apple or Spotify. Of course, subscribe if you're watching on YouTube. Brendan, anything before we get out of here?
Bottoms up, man. Bottoms up.
Bottoms up.
That's all I have to say.
No, I think that's very fair. My final thought, I want to see more comedies like this. And, I mentioned this. We have a video up on the YouTube channel right now. I talked about the summer of 2023 and talked about some of my favorite films that came out this summer. I thought it was a really good year for comedies. or good summer anyway, when you consider this, No Hard Feelings, Joyride.
Yeah.
You know, Barbie, I guess you can lump in there as well.
Barbie you can absolutely lump into there. And I'd say of those comedies, at least those that are very literal comedies, Joyride is my favorite, at least up until this point. I mean, we have more to come out. There's more I still need to see, but that
Theater
one...
Camp is another one.
Oh, yeah, I still haven't seen that one. But yeah, Joyride especially, that one I think is quite a special... I still think about that one every now and then. That one is quite good.
I will say this, as much as I loved Bottoms, and I really did, I still might slightly prefer Joyride, because that film, to me, is equally as funny, but there's something about the sincerity and the poignancy of that film that was that affected me despite, again, the formula. So, but both of them I really liked quite a bit. Theater Camp, I am a huge fan of. Obviously, you know, we're all pretty high on Barbie. So, and Jennifer Lawrence, I mean, she's great in No Hard Feelings. I like that.
Still
film
need to see that one.
That's my least favorite of those 5 specifically, but I still liked it on the whole. And Lawrence is a star; like, she's absolutely magnetic. So, it was a good summer for comedies, I think. At least with those. I mean, you always have your straight to Hulu and Netflix comedies that maybe don't work quite as much.
Yeah, there's probably a reason for that, but But those ones you mentioned, at least those that I've seen, they're very strong, and we definitely want to see movies like that succeed in theaters.
And the only one I didn't see in theaters was No Hard Feelings. The other 4 I did see in theaters.
Okay.
So maybe that has something to do with it as well.
Well, we talk about that. Certain genres like horror and comedy sometimes play well in a crowded house. Yeah. So, take that for what it's worth.
And I just think they're genuinely good movies, good comedies. Lot to love about them. So.
Yeah, if it makes you laugh, it's doing its job.
Absolutely. All right. Anyway, with all of that said, thanks for listening. Thanks for watching, everybody. We will see you next time on the In Session Film Podcast. Oh my God.
Once again, bottoms up.
The cleat gag killed me.